Did you know that for centuries, Attila the Hun was one of the most feared names in the ancient world? But what exactly made this man become the terror of the Roman Empire? How did he, who was not a Roman and did not even have a large army, manage to dominate so many lands and leave the greatest empires of his time on the brink of collapse? What was the secret behind his strength and his terrifying strategy? Now, imagine this. The Roman Empire, known for its grandeur and power, no longer knew how to react. Its defenses, which once seemed impenetrable, were put to the test by Attila, who, with his cunning and an amazing army, made the impossible happen. You will be surprised to discover how he earned the respect of his enemies, and at the same time, spread fear wherever he went. And what's more, I will show you in this video how Attila's choices and his strategic skill were decisive in leaving his mark on history in a way that few have managed. Stay with me, as you will understand what made Attila considered the Scourge of God and what he did to become one of the most feared and enigmatic names of all time. Prepare yourself for a journey full of curiosities and revelations that will surely change the way you see this historical figure. If you are not yet subscribed to the channel, take advantage now to be part of our community. Every interaction you make makes this space more special. In the silent darkness of his tent, surrounded by looted riches and symbols of unquestionable power, Attila, the feared Scourge of God, met an end as sudden as his invasions. On the night he celebrated his wedding to the young Ildiko, a union that could further strengthen his rule, something unexpected happened. When his men entered the room at dawn, they found the great leader lifeless, motionless, as if he had been defeated by an invisible enemy. No sign of a struggle, no evidence of obvious murder, just the body of a man whose death left the world in shock. How could someone so invincible fall without a final war cry? Accounts of what really happened that night are as varied as the territories he ravaged. Some chroniclers of the time, such as the historian Priscus of Panium, have suggested that Attila died of choking on his own blood, the victim of a massive nosebleed, perhaps caused by excessive alcohol consumption or an unknown health problem. Others, however, believe that his death was no accident. Suspicion has fallen on Ildiko, his young wife, who some claim was used as a key figure in a plot to eliminate the Hun king. Was this an assassination ordered by the Romans, or an internal vendetta, plotted by those who feared the growth of his empire? The poisoning theory has also gained traction. Attila's death came at a critical time. Rome had just avoided total destruction by persuading him to retreat, paying huge amounts of gold to keep his troops at bay. But who could guarantee that Attila would keep his word? The Romans knew that any truce with him was only temporary. If he could be eliminated before they could launch a new offensive, the Hunnic threat could finally be contained. Was it a coincidence that he died just when the West most needed a stroke of luck? Other scholars suggest that the cause of death was something even more ironic. The man who had shaken empires may simply have succumbed to a common health problem, such as an aneurysm or a heart attack. His grueling lifestyle, the constant pressure of military campaigns, and the brutality of his battles may have taken a heavy toll. For a warrior accustomed to facing spears and swords, such a quiet death seemed almost absurd. Regardless of the truth, his funeral was a spectacle worthy of the legend he had become. His soldiers mourned the loss of their leader with a unique ritual. They disfigured their own faces, cutting themselves in mourning. They said, "The greatest of warriors should not be mourned with the tears of women, but with the blood of men," they said. Attila's body was placed in a triple coffin, made of gold, silver, and iron, and buried in a secret location so that no one would ever desecrate his grave. The slaves who dug his tomb were executed soon after, ensuring that the Hun king's final resting place would remain a mystery. But if Attila really did die of natural causes, why does his death still seem like an enigma to this day? History never forgives leaders who disappear without explanation, and the mystery of his end has only reinforced his legacy. Like a ghost that looms over history, his figure continues to provoke debate. Was he a victim of betrayal or fate? If he had lived for a few more years, would he have been able to destroy the Western Roman Empire once and for all? The fact is that his death was not the end of the impact he caused. On the contrary, his absence opened a new scenario of disputes between the Huns and their enemies, and the power vacuum he left brought irreversible changes. But before understanding the consequences of this event, it is essential to go back to his origins and discover how a simple Hun boy became one of the most feared men of his time. After all, no empire rises without a beginning, and Attila's journey began long before his name was feared in Rome. Long before he became the terror of Rome, Attila was just a Hun boy, born into a world where survival depended on strength and cunning. His people knew no stone cities or grandiose temples like the Romans. The Huns lived on vast plains, riding horses before they could even walk properly. They were fierce nomads, ruthless hunters, and warriors shaped by the harsh environment in which they grew up. And Attila was taught from an early age that the world offered nothing for free. Everything must be taken with courage and blood. On the arid steppes of Eurasia, a Hun's childhood was a constant battle against the elements and against his own limitations. The biting cold of shelterless nights and the scorching heat of sunny summers were unforgiving to the weak. Hun children did not have the privilege of a carefree childhood. From an early age, they were taught to ride horses and to wield a longbow designed to be fired at full gallop. Anyone who did not learn quickly was left behind, and in the wilds, falling behind meant death. Unlike Roman princes, who were raised in luxurious palaces and surrounded by tutors, Attila grew up with horses, sleeping under leather tents, feeling the relentless wind of the steppes. As a child, he could wield a spear and knew that a warrior fights not only with his muscles, but also with his mind. From an early age, he was trained not only to kill, but to command. His uncle, Rugila, leader of the Huns, made sure that the young man received an education focused on war and diplomacy. He knew that it was not enough to teach Attila to be strong. He had to be ruthless. The Huns had a peculiar way of training their children for war. Unlike the Romans, who had military academies and regimented tactics, the Huns made their lives their own battlefield. The boys were put to brutal tests, dangerous hunts, simulated combats, extreme endurance challenges. They learned to ride for days without rest, to eat the bare minimum, and to endure the cold of the steppes without complaint. Anyone who did not demonstrate resistance or skill was left behind. Among the Huns, weakness had no place. The stories told around the campfires taught that a true leader not only wielded the sword, but also knew when and how to use it. Attila listened attentively to the deeds of his ancestors, the battles against powerful enemies, the alliances sealed in blood. He understood that a leader should inspire respect, not only through fear, but through intelligence. This set him apart from other young warriors. While others only trained their bodies, Attila sharpened his mind. But his education was not limited to the Hun world. While still young, he was sent to the Roman court as a hostage. This may seem dishonorable, but it was a common practice among the great powers of the time. Rome kept the children of barbarian leaders as forced guests, ensuring that their parents would not attack the empire. But instead of becoming a prisoner, Attila turned this experience into an opportunity. Living among the Romans gave him a unique perspective on his enemies. He learned Latin, observed the workings of the empire's politics, saw firsthand the corruption that ran rampant in the upper echelons, and realized that despite its grandeur, Rome was rotten to the core. He understood that the Romans relied too much on their walls and conventional armies, while the Huns were masters of mobility and psychological warfare. While Roman generals debated strategy in marble-lined halls, the Huns were already on the move, attacking before decisions were even made. This experience shaped Attila in a unique way. He was not just a savage barbarian, as many Romans believed. He was a strategist who understood both the barbarian and Roman worlds. This dual vision made him a formidable foe. When he returned to his people, he was no longer just a young warrior. He was a rising leader. His sharp mind knew that his people's strength lay in mobility and ferocity, but he also understood that he could use fear and diplomacy to achieve his goals without having to waste so many lives. Unlike other barbarian leaders who attacked on impulse, Attila learned to wait for the right moment, to make advantageous deals, and to use his own reputation as a weapon. But to rule, he needed to eliminate obstacles, and one of them was very close: his own brother. Attila's fate was sealed, and he knew he could not share it with anyone. The blood that ran through his veins was the same that would be spilled to consolidate his rise. And from that moment on, history would never forget his name. Attila's return to his people was not just the return of a warrior. He returned as a transformed man, ready to lead. But the path to the supreme power of the Huns was not simple. The barbarian world was ruled by fragile alliances, betrayals, and blood feuds. And there was one obstacle that prevented his complete rise: his own brother, Bleda. Bleda and Attila ruled together for a few years, an unstable co-leadership between two men who had different visions for the future of the Huns. While Bleda followed a more conservative line, focusing on consolidating territories and maintaining an advantageous relationship with Rome, Attila saw a much larger horizon. He wanted expansion, absolute power, and an empire that transcended the banks of the Danube. The tension between the two grew, and Attila knew that he could not share the throne for long. Bleda's end came brutally. There are different versions of how he died. Some accounts say that he died in battle against another tribe, while others claim that he was assassinated by Attila himself. Regardless of what really happened, the reality was clear. Attila had emerged as the sole absolute ruler of the Huns, and now nothing could stop him from following his ambition. With the reins of power firmly in his hands, Attila began his campaign of expansion. He not only inherited a powerful army, but refined it, making it even more lethal. The Huns were renowned for their light cavalry and guerrilla tactics that left conventional armies at a loss. But Attila took this to a new level. He implemented new strategies, encouraging tactical alliances with Germanic tribes and using terror as a tool of war. His name spread across Europe as a harbinger of doom. Attila's first campaigns were directed against the Eastern Roman Empire. He knew that Constantinople was rich and, despite its imposing structure, vulnerable. In 447 AD, Attila led a devastating invasion, sacking cities and forcing Emperor Theodosius II to pay even higher tributes to avoid total annihilation. The peace treaty that followed was an insult to Roman dignity. Every year, absurd amounts of gold were given to the Huns as a way of buying peace. But Attila had never intended to be content with bribes alone. With the East subdued, his eyes turned to the West. The perfect opportunity arose when he received a letter from Honoria, the sister of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III. Desperate to escape an arranged marriage, Honoria sent a ring and asked Attila for help. The Hun leader saw this as an ideal pretext to invade Gaul and claim his right to the empire. In 451 AD, Attila led one of the most iconic military campaigns of antiquity, the invasion of Gaul. He marched across the Rhine River, wreaking havoc in his wake. But Rome was not about to bow down so easily. General Flavius Aetius assembled an unlikely coalition of Romans, Visigoths, and Franks to halt the Hun advance. The final showdown took place on the Catalonian fields in one of the bloodiest battles in history. The fighting was fierce. The Huns, with their traditional mobility and skill, faced an army that knew that the survival of the West depended on this moment. The battle ended in a bloody stalemate, but with a slight advantage for the Romans and their allies. For the first time, Attila retreated. This setback, however, was not the end. Attila had not yet finished his revenge against Rome. The following year, in 452 AD, he marched directly on Italy itself, crossing the Alps and sacking cities along the way. Rome trembled with fear, and everything indicated that the Hun leader was about to do the unthinkable: take the Eternal City. But something unexpected happened. In a historic meeting, Pope Leo I went to meet Attila, and in a mysterious way, convinced the conqueror to retreat. There are several theories about what really happened in this encounter. Some say that Attila was bribed. Others believe that famine and disease had weakened his army. And there are those who believe that Attila, a superstitious man, saw the Pope as a divine omen. With his march on Rome halted, Attila returned to his homeland. But his fury had not yet been quenched, and he planned new campaigns to reassert his rule. Little did he know that his own fate was about to be sealed in a manner as dramatic as his rise. The strength of an empire does not always lie in the size of its armies, but in the mind of its leader. And Attila understood this better than anyone. But what happens when the greatest warrior of his time becomes a victim of his own fate? It is an outcome that few could have foreseen, but one that changed the course of history forever. Attila's strength lay not only in the brutality of his attacks, but in the way he viewed war. While Roman generals still followed predictable tactical patterns based on heavy formations and frontal combat, the Huns brought something new to the battlefield: speed, adaptation, and psychological terror. Every move of the Hun army was meticulously calculated to wear down the enemy before the first blow was even struck. The Hun cavalry was legendary. Unlike the heavy Roman legionaries, who relied on orderly formations and rigorous marching, Attila's warriors were agile and ferocious, able to charge and retreat before the enemy knew where the blows were coming from. They used composite bows, an advanced technology for the time, allowing them to fire deadly arrows even while riding at high speed. This ability to fire without losing mobility made each Hun warrior an unpredictable foe. The Romans were accustomed to facing armies that followed a fixed pattern of combat, but Attila forced them to fight in a way they were unprepared for. But war was not just about armies and weapons. It was also about fear. Attila understood this better than any other leader of his time. He knew that often the best way to win a battle was to make the enemy surrender before they even fought. His name was whispered in terror across Europe, and he used this to his advantage. Entire cities surrendered without resistance simply for fear of suffering the fate of others who dared to defy him. This strategy saved resources, men, and time, allowing the Huns to advance further and further without encountering significant barriers. Furthermore, Attila mastered the art of unpredictability. He did not follow fixed patterns, attacking when least expected and retreating when everyone thought he would advance. In an era where warfare followed unwritten rules, he excelled at breaking them. This confused the Romans, who found themselves unable to predict his next moves. This element of surprise turned even small Hun incursions into complete disasters for the defenders. One of the most iconic moments of his campaign was the invasion of Gaul in 451 AD. His advance was relentless, destroying cities and fortifications without anyone being able to stop him. When he was finally confronted by Roman and Visigoth forces at the Battle of the Catalonian Fields, the clash was so brutal that the fields were covered in bodies. Even without achieving a definitive victory, Attila proved that he could face Rome on its own territory and emerge virtually unscathed. His army withdrew, but the damage had already been done. The Roman Empire's reputation as an invincible force had been destroyed. Attila was not just a warrior, but a strategist. He knew how to use his enemies' weaknesses against them. Rome was in decline, divided between internal disputes and incompetent leaders, and he took advantage of this. Instead of confronting the empire directly, he used negotiations, alliances, and threats to force concessions. He often received exorbitant tributes just to spare cities, enriching his empire without having to spend a single soldier. But Attila's psychological warfare was not limited to the battlefields and Roman walls. He understood the power of image. He dressed simply, without showing off his wealth, to show that he did not need gold to be feared. His meetings were direct, without pompous protocols, demonstrating that he did not bow to the customs of his enemies. Every detail of his posture reinforced his aura of invincibility. And while Rome was reeling from the threat of the Huns, Attila was already planning his next move. But what could come next? How could someone who had already challenged the greatest empire of the age go even further? The answer lay in one of the most surprising episodes in his history, an unexpected invitation that would change the course of his campaign. You won't want to miss it. Attila's invasions were not just displays of military strength. They shook the foundations of an empire that was already fragile. By the 5th century, Rome was no longer the unshakable powerhouse it had been centuries before. Divided between East and West, torn by internal strife, and threatened by multiple enemies, the empire was becoming increasingly vulnerable. The arrival of the Huns and the devastation wrought by Attila accelerated a process of collapse that was already underway, but his influence went far beyond plunder and destruction. The Scourge of God not only conquered territory, but also forced geopolitical changes that reshaped the map of Europe. The Romans, accustomed to dealing with barbarians who eventually assimilated their customs and became part of the empire, faced a different enemy in Attila. He did not want to be Roman, nor did he want titles or recognition from the Senate. His goal was different: domination and tribute. The cities that fell before his army were not only pillaged, but also emptied of their population, leaving behind a trail of terror and mass displacement. Entire peoples fled even before the Huns arrived, spreading chaos and destabilizing borders. The brutality of his campaigns was not random, but rather a calculated strategy. By sowing fear, Attila avoided long sieges and unnecessary battles. Many cities preferred to pay exorbitant tributes rather than face certain destruction. Psychological terror was as powerful a weapon as his hordes of horsemen. Legends of his cruelty ran ahead of his army, causing his enemies to surrender even before combat. One of the most striking moments of this impact occurred at the Battle of the Catalaunian Fields. In 451 AD, the clash between Attila's forces and a coalition led by the Roman general Flavius Aetius, which included Visigoths and other Germanic peoples, was one of the last great battles of the Western Roman Empire. Although it was not a crushing defeat for the Huns, this battle prevented Attila from taking full control of Gaul, forcing him to retreat. But the damage had already been done. The mere need for Rome to resort to barbarian allies to stop an enemy demonstrated how much the empire had lost its former supremacy. The following year, Attila turned his attention to Italy, devastating cities and instilling even more fear among the Romans. It was in this context that the famous meeting between Attila and Pope Leo I took place. It is said that, upon seeing the leader of the Roman Church, Attila was impressed by his presence and decided to spare Rome. Some accounts claim that a divine vision convinced him to retreat. Others suggest that it was a strategic move, since the Hun army was already weakened. Either way, the event reinforced Attila's image as a figure so feared that even the church had to intervene personally to prevent a greater disaster. But what really led Attila to retreat? Was it just superstition? Or did he see something that no one else did? Some historians believe that he realized that Rome was already in ruins and not worth the effort. Others argue that he was persuaded by secret promises of gold and tribute. The truth may never be known, but this episode added another layer of mystery to his legend. Even after Attila's death, the impact of his campaigns continued to be felt. His empire could not survive long without his strong leadership, but the power vacuum he left helped hasten Rome's collapse. The destruction of cities, the movement of peoples, and the instability caused by their invasions contributed directly to the end of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, when the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. And it was not only Rome that felt the effects. The movement of the Huns forced other tribes to migrate, putting even more pressure on the empire's borders and creating a domino effect that changed the course of European history. Peoples such as the Goths and Vandals, who were once allies or distant enemies, ended up playing crucial roles in the fall of Rome and the formation of the kingdoms that would emerge in the Middle Ages. But the story does not end there. Attila's legacy endured for centuries to come, shaping not only European history but also the narratives surrounding his name. He was portrayed as a monster, an unbeatable warrior, a cunning leader, and even as a divine instrument of punishment. His figure transcended reality and became a symbol of power and destruction. And even today, centuries later, his name still resonates as one of the greatest conquerors in history. If Attila had lived longer, would he have managed to overthrow Rome once and for all? Would the West have followed a different path? History has its answers, but imagination allows us to question. Now, I want to know from you, if Attila had marched on Rome and planted his flag in the heart of the empire, how do you think the world would have changed? Let me know what you think, because history is not only about the past, but also about possibilities that never came to fruition. So, now that you know a little more about Attila the Hun and how much he managed to terrorize the Romans, here's a warning. Don't underestimate the power of a leader who knows how to use intelligence to his advantage. Sometimes, the greatest strength lies not only in weapons, but in strategies and the courage to do what no one expects. Keep an eye out, because in historical moments, like Attila's, it is cunning and determination that can change everything. Who knows? Maybe at some point in your life, you will find yourself in a situation where you need to be as smart as he was. And of course, if you enjoyed this story and want to know more about other incredible characters like Attila, be sure to comment below. What other historical figures would you like to know more about? Tell us in the comments and let's talk. See you next time.